Let's continue Mein Kampf. Yesterday, during my last read, Hitler first first lamented about a canonical child in Vienna not only having abusive parents but also did not concern about studies. Become uh, he or she became very vain, um, and Hitler talked about him finally having better job and started reading. Then he also lamented or satirized people who read books in a not effective way. And also, yeah, I'll just continue. Only thus can reading have any meaning or be worthwhile. The speaker, for example, who has not the sources of information ready to hand, which are necessary to a proper treatment of his subject, is unable to defend his opinions against an opponent, even though those opinions be perfectly sound and true. In every discussion, his memory will leave him shamefully in the lurch. He cannot summon up arguments to support his statements or to refute his opponent. So long as the speaker has only to defend himself on his own personal account, the situation is not serious, but evil comes when chance places at the head of public affairs, such as soi disant know-it-all, who in reality knows nothing. From early youth, I endeavored to read books in the right way, and I was fortunate in having good memory and intelligence to assist me. From that point of view, my sojourn in Vienna was particularly useful and profitable. My experiences of everyday life there were a constant stimulus to study the most diverse problems from new angles. Inasmuch as I was in a position to put theory to the test of reality and reality to the test of theory, I was safe from the danger of pedantic theorizing on the one hand, and on the other from being too impressed by the superficial aspects of reality. The experience of everyday life at the time determined me to make a fundamental theoretical study of two most important questions outside of the social question. It is impossible to say when I might have started to make a thorough study of the doctrine and characteristics of Marxism, were it not for the fact that I then literally ran head foremost into the problem. What I knew of social democracy in my youth was precious little, and that little was for the most part wrong. The fact that it led the struggle for universal suffrage and the secret ballot gave me an inner satisfaction. For my reason then told me that this would weaken the Habsburg regime, which I so thoroughly detested. I was convinced that even if it should sacrifice the German element, the Danubian state could not continue to exist, even at the price of a long and slow Slavization of the Austrian Germans. The state would secure no guarantee of a really durable empire, because it was very questionable if and how the Slavs possessed the necessary capacity for constructive politics. Therefore, I welcomed every movement that might lead towards the final disruption of that impossible state which had decreed that it would stamp out the German character in 10 millions of people. The more this babel of tongues wrought discord and disruption, even in the parliament, the nearer the hour approached for the dissolution of this Babylonian empire. That would mean the liberation of my German Austrian people, and only then would it become possible for them to be reunited to the motherland. Accordingly, I had no feelings of antipathy towards the actual policy of the Democrats. That is avowed purpose was that its avowed purpose was to raise the level of the working classes, which in my ignorance I then foolishly believed was a further reason why I should speak in favor of social democracy rather than against it. But the features that contributed most to estrange me from the social democratic movement was its hostile attitude towards the struggle for the conservation of Germanism in Austria, its lamentable concocting with the Slav comrades who received these approaches favorably as long as any practical advantages were forthcoming, but otherwise maintained a haughty reserve, thus giving the importunate mendicants the sort of answer their behavior deserved. And so at the age of 17, the word Marxism was very little known to me, while I look at social democracy and socialism as synonymous expressions. It was only as a result of a sudden blow from the rough hand of fate that my eyes were opened to the nature of this unparalleled system for duping the public. Hitherto my acquaintance with the Social Democratic Party was only that of a mere spectator at some of their mass meetings. I had not the slightest idea of the social democratic teaching, or the mentality of its partisans. All of a sudden I was brought face to face with the products of their teaching and what they called the Weltanschauung. In this way, a few months sufficed for me to learn something which under other circumstances might have necessitated decades of study, namely that under the cloak of social virtue and love of one's neighbor, a veritable pestilence was spreading abroad, and that if this pestilence be not stamped out of the world without delay, it may eventually succeed in exterminating the human race. Let me decipher it. Yeah, it seems a bit difficult to understand the prose. Give me a minute, please. I first came into contact with the Social Democrats while working in the building trade. From the very time that I started work, the situation was not very pleasant for me. My clothes were still rather decent. I was careful of my speech and I was reserved in manner. I was so occupied with thinking of my own present lot or my present lot and future possibilities, that I did not take much of an interest in my immediate surroundings. I had sought work so that I shouldn't starve and at the same time so as to be able to make further headway with my studies, though this headway might be slow. Possibly I should not have bothered to be interested in my companions, were it not that on the third or fourth day an event occurred which forced me to take a definite stand. I was ordered to join the trade union. At that time, I knew nothing about the trade unions. I had had no opportunity of forming an opinion on their utility or inutility, as the case might be. But when I was told that I must join the union, I refused. The grounds which I gave for my refusal was simply that I knew nothing about the matter and that anyhow I would not allow myself to be forced into anything. Probably the former reason saved me from being thrown out right away. They probably thought that within a few days I might be converted and become more docile. But if they thought that they were profoundly mistaken. But if they thought that, they were profoundly mistaken. After 2 weeks, I found it utterly impossible for me to take such a step, and even if I had been willing to take it at first. During those 14 days, I came to know. I beg your pardon. During those 14 days, I came to know my fellow workmen better, and no power in the world could have moved me to join an organization whose representatives had meanwhile shown themselves in a light which I found so unfavorable. During the first days, my resentment was aroused. At midday, some of my fellow workers used to adjourn to the nearest tavern, while the others remained on the building premises and there ate their midday meal, which in most cases was a very scanty one. These were married men. Their wives brought them the midday soup in dilapidated vessels. Towards the end of the week, there was a gradual increase in the number of those who remained to eat their midday meal on the building premises. I understood the reason for this afterwards. They now talked politics. I drank my bottle of milk and ate my morsel of bread somewhere on the outskirts, while I circumspectly studied my environment or else fell to meditating on my own harsh lot. Yet I heard more than enough, and I often thought that some of what they said was meant for my ears, in the hope of bringing me to a decision. But all that I heard had the effect of arousing the strongest antagonism in me. Everything was disparaged. The nation, because it was held to be an invention of the capitalist class. How often I had to listen to that phrase. The fatherland, because it was held to be an instrument in the hands of the bourgeoisie for the exploitation of the working masses. The authority of the law. The authority of the law, because that was a means of holding down the proletariat. Religion as a means of doping people so as to exploit them afterwards. Morality as a badge of stupid and sheepish docility. There was nothing that they did not drag in the mud. At first I remained silent, but that could not last very long. Then I began to take part in the discussion and to reply to their statements. I had to recognize, however, that this was bound to be entirely fruitless, as long as I did not have at least a certain amount of definite information about the questions that were discussed. So I decided to consult the source from which my interlocutors claimed to have drawn the so-called wisdom. I devoured book after book, pamphlet after pamphlet. Meanwhile, we argued with one another on the building premises. From day to day, I was becoming better informed than my companions in the subjects on which they claimed to be experts. Then a day came when the more redoubtable of my adversaries resorted to the most effective weapon they had to replace the force of reason. This was intimidation and physical force. Some of the leaders among my adversaries ordered me to leave the building or else get flung down from the scaffolding. As I was quite alone, I could not put up any physical resistance, so I chose the first alternative and departed, richer, however, by an experience. I went away full of disgust, but at the same time so deeply moved that it was quite impossible for me to turn my back on the whole situation and think no more about it. Okay, I'll stop here and continue another day. Goodbye.